Hey everyone, it's Njeri as the voice from beyond. Last year, I decided to start a series called Toronto Afrofuturists so that I could profile all the amazing people living in Toronto who are creating works of literature that are based in Black speculative fiction and fantasy, also sci-fi. So I hope that you enjoy this first interview with Terese Mason Pierre, who is a poet, a writer, a book reviewer, and who also has these amazing book looks over Twitter. Enjoy, and I'll see you in my next video. Terese, thank you very much for being my first interview in my Toronto Afrofuturists series. I really appreciate your time. So I found out about you because I read an article that you wrote about being an Afrofuturist and being Canadian, and I thought, I don't know that I've ever read an article like that before, and it was really, really nice to learn about you through that article. So I want to just start with the basics, sort of who are you question. So I obviously know that you're a writer, so how would you describe yourself as a writer?
That's a very interesting question. I would describe myself, well, for now as a poet, and that's only because that's just the most amount of work that I write and publish.
Yeah.
And then I have a couple of essays, but mainly I would describe myself as a poet. And in terms of the kinds of poetry that I write, I consider myself a little bit on the conservative side. Like I write about romance, I write about nature, and things that I want to explore in those realms. Like there's all sorts of weird and interesting poetry, like visual poetry and sound poetry, and I'm like way too scared to get into any of those things. So I kind of stick with those topics. And most recently, I've been exploring speculative poetry, specifically speculative poetry that sort of focuses more on Blackness and on femininity and womanhood. And I'm really excited to see like where that will go. But in terms of like my overall sort of idea of myself as a writer, I mainly stick to like the romance nature side, and I find that there's still a lot of things I can write about.
Sure. And what is Black speculative poetry? Because I will admit, I have never, I mean, I've heard of the term, but I've never really explored it, and I don't understand even the concept of speculative poetry.
Yeah, so the word speculative in general is quite broad. The way I like to describe it, speculative poetry is sort of looking at using speculative fiction as like an analog, in the sense that there's like a wide range of stories you can tell about other worlds or about alternate worlds and fantasy and things like that. So you can move from like your typical like Star Wars, Narnia kind of realm, and you move over into like the Murakami kind of like dreamy surrealism kind of area. And I describe speculative poetry in the same way. So I know speculative poets who write about aliens, who write about other worlds or other universes. And I also know speculative poets who write about, waking up from a dream, or sort of exploring different fantasy aspects of the real world. So I encompass all of that within speculative poetry. With Black speculative poetry specifically, I think it's sort of speculative poetry that focuses on Black futures, Black people, or like written by Black writers. And there's also, like I said, like a wide range of things you can think about. It's not just about, aliens and mermaids, and those are things I like to write about, but
I love reading about mermaids.
Oh man, I love mermaids. Mermaids are great. Black mermaids, awesome.
Can we just have a moment for Black mermaids? Because
yes, okay, yes. Okay, there's this book. Okay, what's the book? There's this book by I think her name is Bethany Morrow that's coming out, and
yes.
I've heard of it. It's yeah, okay, it's like blue. It's got like two Black women on the cover, and their hair is kind of going up like that. The name of the book is escaping me.
Me too.
But Yeah, I'm waiting for that book. Also,
Yeah.
The Deep
Yeah.
by River Solomon.
Yeah.
Perfect. That's what I want. That's what I like.
Yes, so I read The Deep. My favorite book is Nalo Hopkinson's uh, uh, In the New Moon's Arms, which is, I don't know
Okay.
if you've read that one, because I know that you've read her work. So yeah, The New Moon's Arms is a mer person story. And then I also really liked Mother of the Sea by Zeta Elliott, who is Canadian. So those ones are cool too. But I'm really looking forward to reading more. And even I haven't read this one, but The Water Dancer. It's not. I don't even know the story, but Ta-Nehisi Coates. But I think this.
Oh yeah.
There's something about water, so
I didn't know it was speculative.
it is speculative for sure.
Okay, I have to check that out now because I didn't know. Yeah.
What do you love about Black Mermaid stories and Black Mermaid lore?
I love that or at least the stories I've read about have really sort of focused on Black women, and their power and how they sort of handle and live through their own histories.
Yeah.
And also, I just like mermaids. Like for the longest while, I thought that mermaids had to be white and living in so and so place. But I'm like, no, Black people can be mermaids too. There's this whole thing online about Hallie being the Black Little Mermaid, and I was like, excellent.
Yeah.
Well, of course, this it's about time. We need to see this now. But they're just so mystical and are they there? Are they not? Are they dangerous? You don't know. I just think they're great. I love mermaids. Yeah, I didn't know I love mermaids. It was just like a love I just realized I had in the past couple of years. But yeah.
Yeah, I remember when I realized how much I love them too, which is really
they're so great.
Nice. I'm really attracted to the idea that that there were people who decided not to make it all the way through the Middle Passage and instead decided to be mermaids or were enveloped by the sea. Like that whole concept of there was a third option and there was survival and they could still be there. There's something very interesting and hopeful about that story. So I love that. Do you identify as an Afrofuturist? What does Afrofuturism mean to you?
I'm in terms of identity, I've always been the kind of person to sort of defer to authority and definitions. I think I'm working towards being an Afrofuturist. But I don't think I'm there yet. And that's okay. I'm totally okay with that. But it's something that I aspire to be. I look at the work of people who are sort of very confidently and clearly centered in that space. And I'm like, that's over there. That's what I'm going there, right?
Okay.
But I feel like I'm not there yet, or at least within fiction, because I have not written a lot of fiction. I wrote maybe one story a while back about a Black superhero. But mostly what I've been doing is poetry. And how I define Afrofuturism, I think it's literature that is centered around Blackness and all its various forms. I wrote about in my article about how I felt that some forms of Afrofuturism center certain kinds of Black history and certain kinds of Black experiences, and I didn't identify with those kinds. But then I realized that there's no right way, and I finished writing an essay about this last night. There's no right way or real way to be Black, and there's no right way or real way to sort of talk about your Blackness. There's so much diversity within the Black experience. A lot of us, if not all of us, have descended from slaves. So we do have that history and we can talk about that in various ways. But I would say it's literature written by Black people, written by the African diaspora, the Caribbean diaspora, Black people from all over the world, centering Blackness and aiming and aspiring to see Blackness in the future. Like you read a lot of like these far future stories and you're wondering like, where are the Black people? But also like, where are the queer people? Where are the disabled people? Like, where are all these groups? Everyone is like white, and it's so strange. So these like future stories that center Blackness and that show Blackness as a concept and as a force that persists and progresses and thrives, essentially, is how I sort of see Afrofuturism.
I love that, Blackness as a force that persists and thrives. You said something else, exists, persists, and thrives, I think.
Yeah.
That is so important, because I remember when I was younger and I watched shows like The X-Files or The Twilight Zone, or what else? Third Rock from the Sun, like anything that had some kind of alien element to it, or futuristic, even the Jetsons, right? I was born in a decade, so we might have different cultural references from like that, but it was just really, it was really interesting because I just wasn't there, right? And growing up, I believed that we weren't actually there, and it wasn't a conscious thought. It was just that we're going to go somewhere else. Like, we're not going to go to the stars. We're going to be somewhere else. We're not going to be in spaceships. We'll just be somewhere else. But that somewhere else was really in oblivion, because we just weren't written in to all of those places until, of course, Star Trek TNG, and then there's like one or two or three of us. But
yeah.
And I'm happy that there, that we had LeVar Burton, and we had Whoopi Goldberg, and some of the other actors that played characters in that series. But that's why Afrofuturism is so important to me, because it is about deliberately placing all Black peoples into this continuum that goes on into the future, so that we can actually plan ahead, right, with ourselves in mind. So you said something I'm just going to read a quote in your article, and I will link your article below. And once your new article comes out, I'll link that as well, so that as people watch this, they can keep up with your work. But you said, I thought I had to write about that kind of ancestry, culture-infused literature for it to be legitimate Black speculative fiction, for it to count in the realm of Afrofuturism, like Nnedi Okorafor and Tomi Adeyemi and Nalo Hopkinson. I felt I needed to draw upon my specific heritage, one I already knew little about, in order to write properly. And you started talking a little bit about that already, but I want to focus not on the lack and what you felt that you couldn't do or couldn't write about. And I want to sort of pivot to what is the center of this, of your Afrofuturist vision, or the writing that you aspire to produce. So, and how does that link with your heritage and your culture? I think you're Trini and you have a Grenadian background, I want to say. Does that figure into anything?
My parents are both Grenadian. I lived in Trinidad for 2 years in my childhood, and that was great. But you're a child. When you're a child, there's just things you don't see and don't experience just because you're a child. Actually, I received 2 grants from the Toronto Arts Council and the Ontario Arts Council to write a book of poetry, and I wanted to write about speculative poetry. And I had all these plans in my head. I'm like, I'm going to go to the Caribbean. I'm going to go to like Grenada and Jamaica and Trinidad and Barbados. I'm going to spend time there. I'm going to write these Black speculative poems. And of course, like COVID happened and I can't travel, but I'm still finding ways to write about those things. I always think about, like, I've done this ever since I like graduated from universities. Like, I think about all the things I don't know. I'm very aware of the things I don't know.
Right.
And I always try to think about how I can fill those gaps. So specifically with my own cultural background, both my parents are Grenadian. They immigrated to Canada in the 1980s. And sometimes my mom would talk about, like the revolution, or like when the US invaded, which I didn't know about. Like, I didn't know the US invaded Grenada. And she would give these, like, drop these little things, and I'd be like, I would like more information. And she was like, well, you're Canadian, you live in Canada now, like, who cares? But I cared really deeply. So when I felt that, because when I saw all those writers drawing from, like, say, their Nigerian heritage or their Jamaican or Trinidadian heritage, I was like, oh, when I write about these things, I can't draw from those vessels because I don't have that knowledge. So what I like to do, or what I have been doing recently with my poetry, sort of looking up like Caribbean folklore and Caribbean myths specific to Grenada or in the region. Like I read a lot about like Anansi and Laja Bless and like all those, and like Jabs and like all those kinds of creatures, and I'm finding them really fascinating. But before all that happened, I had to think about what was a sort of Afrofuturistic writing that I could write about without having doing all that research. Right. So I thought, well, I can write about myself living in Toronto as a Black person and knowing other Black Toronto people living in Toronto, like in 2019, 2020, just existing. And I'm like, that counts too, right? This is a very multicultural city and there are lots of Black people here, and there are different neighborhoods and things like that. And if I wanted to write those people into the future, into a futuristic Toronto, I can still do that. And I don't need to draw on like, Grenada or West Africa in order to do that. So when I realized that, I became a lot more comfortable with writing. I decided like a long time ago, a couple years ago, that I would just only write Black characters. Like it's just a thing that I was gonna do. And I found out that there's still a richness in like, say, Black people in Canada that lends itself really well to futuristic settings. I can talk about Black people in Nova Scotia. I can talk about Black people in Southern Ontario, and like all these sorts of things that I can do without having to like leave my actual house and go to a Caribbean island to learn about those sorts of things. Mm-hmm. So knowing that and realizing that was really fun. I'm personally attracted to all of the very specific like Black or Afrofuturistic stories that take place in Toronto. So like Nell Hopkinson's Brown Girl in the Ring is like my fave. I'm like, yeah, she's Black. She's living in Toronto. Like she's going down through Toronto. I'm like, I know where that street is. I identify with that very strongly. Another writer, Lizelle Sambury.
Yes.
She has, so her books are going to be in Toronto. I was like, yes, this is what I need. This is what I need. So I think that sounds so like
nice. Is it called Blood Witch? Do you know the title?
Blood Like Magic.
Blood Like Magic. So like Black witches in Toronto. I'm like, first of all, me. And I want to read it. I want to
read too. Like I was very bold when I met Lizelle. I was like, I followed her on Twitter, and then I just messaged her because she was going to be on a panel. I was like, hey, we're strangers. You don't know me at all, but you're going to be on this panel that I'm going to attend. Do you want to like have dinner earlier? And she was like, yeah. So then we had dinner and it was great. But I feel like because I live in Toronto, and I say I'm from Toronto even though I was born in Mississauga, but like this is the space that I've spent the most amount of my formative years in my life in. So I say I'm from Toronto, and I would like an Afrofuturism or an Afrofuturistic literature to reflect that reality and the reality of a lot of my Black friends. So that's what I'm like actively conceiving of and writing into my fiction that I occasionally do, or like my poetry and things like that.
I'm so ready to read what you write. So let's just I will gently, because I've been told recently that I can be a little pushy, so I'm just gonna say I'm looking forward to reading what you write. As opposed to write it out. But yeah,
thank you.
I'm so ready.
Yes, writing. What is that? Yeah.
So I read that you presented on a panel that was about hierarchy and oppression in science fiction and fantasy. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so that panel was great. I was also with Charlie Jane Anders, who is a big sci-fi writer. She's really cool. Really cool. So we essentially talked about the ways in which speculative fiction is used to sort of deliver, like, I want to say moral lessons almost, about oppression and hierarchy of different groups surrounding the hegemony in this reality. So it's like, well, okay, we can't write about, like brown people or Muslims, so we'll put like aliens, and then we'll have the same things, and then people will sort of like clue in that like those are supposed to be brown people and Muslims, and then they'll sort of realize through reading the sci-fi literature that it's like not good to be racist and Islamophobic, right? And I personally am not really, I see how that can work in some instances, but I also feel like we should, maybe sort of treat readers as like more intelligent, that they can sort of get those sort of lessons without having to resort to aliens, because aliens are really always a stand-in for people of color anyway.
Yes.
But it's like, but that's why it's so important to have like Black people and other people of different races in these futuristic stories, so then we can let people know that they're still here and they matter just as much or even more as they matter now. Also, like science fiction has also been used in the past to denigrate different minority groups through this sort of weird, they're aliens, they're gnomes, they're goblins, they're all kinds of masking. And it's very strange, and I think it's kind of, I don't know why it's done. I think it's a very weird way to sort of mask whatever prejudices you have, and people will pick up on that. Like I said, readers are intelligent. They'll see exactly what you're talking about, and they'll go and write stories, replicating and perpetuating those ideas. So we talked about that on the panel, and yeah, a lot of the people sort of had that mindset, and we sort of also talked about how we can sort of shape our speculative fiction writing and in going forward and in our communities to better serve those who are marginalized, as specifically marginalized people, but also the marginalized writers who are writing in this community and seeing what's being produced. So I'm personally very happy whenever I see like racialized people writing sci-fi and fantasy, and them writing themselves in sci-fi and fantasy as a way to combat like real world oppression or real world hierarchies and things like that. Yeah, I think you can only get better from here.
Are there any particular artists, any writers, or books or book series that are particularly inspiring for you because those authors are writing themselves in or writing Black folks or people of color in a way that feels right to you?
Yeah, who does this? Rick Riordan has like a sort of an imprint with Disney Hyperion. I'm not sure if that's a publisher, but he has an imprint where he sort of brings in writers of color to write fantasy and myth. So like one of the ones I remember is Tristan Strong Punches a Hole in the Sky. Which is about Black people and it's fantasy, and it's Black people and it's great, and he has different people who are South Asian and East Asian and Hispanic, and like they're writing themselves into their fantasy and their science fiction. I also really enjoy Rebecca Roanhorse's work. She's Black and Indigenous, so she writes a lot of those stories and those realities into her work. Yeah, so those are the ones I really love and I really pay attention to.
Nice. I have those. I haven't read them yet, but I do have them, and I want to. I'm really interested in middle grade. I have to read middle grade right now, but I'm also interested in middle grade because it's a time where so much identity formation happens with young people.
Yeah.
And it's also a time where I develop my love for reading. So yes. I like that you mentioned Rick Riordan Presents. So I have a couple of more questions for you, but I want to talk about one piece that you wrote. It's a poem called Unbraided Clean. And it was really like, I'm gonna like first tell you how much I loved it and why I loved it, and then I'm gonna ask you questions about it. But I need a moment to express.
Take all the time.
Unbraided Clean. I can smell her grease when I drive into the lot, and I feel the child inside me move. Small spine arching into an auspice. I walk through rows of headstones, scarlet sun casting shadows over short grass, glittering off my headscarf. I carry an offering, cassava, white yam, festivals I made this morning, coconut cake. I sit at my mother's grave and place the bowl of food under her name carved in rock. I rub the moon of my belly, an incomparable channel to reach her. The sun bleeds violet over the hills, and I ask my mother to come to me. She appears wispy and slow, soft mosquito netting rising from dark earth, her locks fanned round her head like a crown. Her large hands reach out to me. I reach in return, and her hand is solid around mine, warm. I turn my back to her tombstone, and she unwraps the scarf on my head. My hair pours out thick into the sky, and I feel my mother's hands through it, combing with her fingers for knots, for fragile bits. When I come to the grave for her to plait my hair, she wants it unbraided, clean. When she first rose to meet me, I, clutching roses, lamented that I could not do it on my own, that, with child, I could never learn. And my mother opened her coconut grease, patted the grass before her thighs, and I settled. She is quick with this ancient work, her finger decadent, my scalp relishing. She hums hymns, she speaks in a low voice of her family, those who crossed with her, and I speak of my own child, how she moves in me, what it is like to house a soul. Often, I think about rising out of my own grave, plaiting my own child's hair. What they will offer me for time, I will freely give. It is nearly midnight when she finishes, and small twists greet my fingers when I reach up, the hair smelling of her. At times I'm left wondering if I've dreamt the whole event, if I'm like those who have not passed safely through grief, if I hold on too tightly, her essence splitting, breaking, or if she does sit warmly in my kitchen, holding me, pulling me smooth. Unbraided Clean by Terese Mason Pierre.
I cried when I first read the poem for the very first time. I cried.
Thank you.
I am not going to cry now, but
Okay.
we'll see. We'll see. Black people can have feelings. Black sisters can have feelings. So I cried because it was, there are certain, okay, now I feel emotional. Okay, so there are certain aspects of Black childhood and Black girlhood that are so intimate and are like objectively magical, like they actually are magical moments. But there's so many of those moments that I never identified as like magical or beautiful. And I didn't realize that. So when I read Unbraided Clean the first time, I cried because it was one of those moments, like, you know, when you talked about reading Nalo Hopkinson and being able to see like magic and Black people and Toronto and all of that combined. And it was just like, wow, this magic, this possibility exists here in my city.
Mm-hmm.
I felt that when I read Unbraided Clean, because here was this memory that I had of, you know, my mother combing my hair on a regular basis, like combs and grease and connection. And I remembered feeling that as a child. And actually, I looked forward to my mother combing my hair. I loved my mother combing my hair. And sitting down in between her knees, watching something on television and having her comb my hair. And that was like such like one of my most beautiful childhood memories growing up. I looked forward to that time with her. And when I read your poem, I was like, that's like a magical moment of connection. And that can be a portal. Like that can be a portal to another world. It can be a portal to ancestor reverence. It can be all of those things. And I hadn't realized that before. And it was only when reading your poem that I was like, oh my gosh, I do identify as an Afrofuturist. And I hadn't even made that connection in that particular moment. So I want to thank you for writing that poem, because it was a breakthrough moment for me reading it. And you know how they say that we are the ones that we're waiting for, like, especially where writing is concerned. Like, oftentimes when we desire a particular kind of story, it's usually because we're meant to write it.
Mm-hmm.
When I read what you wrote, I was like, you were meant to write that story. Like, there was no one else who could have written that particular poem that would have been able to do exactly what you did. So I want to thank you for, I don't know what led you to write that poem. I don't know how many versions of it you wrote. I don't know if you ever thought, no one wants to read this, I'm not doing it. Like, I don't know what your journey was, but I am so very happy and grateful that you wrote that poem, because like, it changed things for me. And I read it at a time when I was having a lot of problems with poetry, because I don't read, it's not easy for me to read poetry. So
Understandable.
It can be hard,
Yeah.
Because so much of it is inaccessible.
So true. That's so true.
So anyway, that is just me just being like, thank you, and I love you.
Thank you. That's like, no one's ever said those things about my work before, so I'm very happy. This is the first for me too, so I'm getting very excited. Very excited.
So tell me about it. But tell me about that poem. And
yeah, so I tend to write poems very quickly. I took my time with this one. This poem was published in FIA, which is like a US-based Black speculative journal. I've been published in there twice. And they had a hair issue. So then I was like, oh, I can write a poem about hair. And I was like, oh, well, like, and I got like all very anxious. I'm like, okay, well, what can I as a Black person write about hair that hasn't been said before? You know, so I felt that kind of anxiety. Then I just thought about, well, it was around the time I have to do my own hair, and I was like, I can't cornrow, so my mom has to do it for me. So then I wrote that poem in about a couple hours of the deadline, and they're like, this poem is great. And I was like, are you sure? And they're like, yes, here is money. But yeah, so I wanted to sort of express both like the reverence that I have for like the ritual of Black hair, but also the fact that ritual can persist seemingly, or maybe, yeah, definitely after death. So then in the poem, like, the speaker's mother sort of rises from her grave to sit and braid her daughter's hair, and the daughter, who is pregnant with her own child, is worrying about how she's going to replicate that for her daughter. So it's kind of like an interesting, like, generational thing, a part of life and a part of our culture that doesn't really go away. During this quarantine, actually, I have learned how to corner my hair.
Nice.
And then my mom was like, this is just something that can't be taught. You just have to like figure it out. And I'm like, this is like a rite of passage. I don't know how to corner my hair, but like, I figured it out. I've loosed it out now. But I think I was very excited. I was very excited to know about hair and how to do my hair, and I wanted to sort of immortalize that in a poem for Black people, and to sort of celebrate that love that we have for our hair, and that magic that comes with that process and that ritual. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you did it.
Oh, thanks.
So you're writing this. I was going to ask you about the Black speculative poetry book that you're writing, but you've talked about it in terms of locating it within Toronto and just looking around you and drawing from what you see in Toronto, and the Black experience in Toronto. As somebody who also grew up in Toronto, like North York, Etobicoke, now living in downtown Toronto, what is magical? What inspires you about the Black experience in our city?
The most interesting thing for me about being Black in Toronto is that, unlike, say, like the Caribbean or parts of Africa, we are a minority, like very clearly a minority in the city, which means that we have to find new and innovative ways to sort of combat that othering that is sort of pushed on us as we try to navigate our daily basic lives. And I find that even within like something as broad as Canadian literature, is really sort of focused right now on like looking at different marginalized writers and being like, oh, you know, you're Indigenous and you write about this, or you're Black and you write about this, kind of like breaking free of those like restraints on, you know, what it means to be Black and a Black writer. Because as a Black person, I can write about literally whatever I want, right? But you know, I don't have to write just about like, you know, being Black and going to the grocery store and while I'm Black and like all those interesting things. So I like Toronto because there's so much history here. There's so many different sort of avenues to learning about that history. I find that I've been told by different people that because a lot of Black people came to Toronto as immigrants, that it's like to find like an interesting or sort of solid footing in the city, but I feel like it has been done. I'm constantly reading about, you know, what it's like to be, you know, Black in the 90s or Black in the 70s in Toronto, and how Black people were sort of like carving their path and making like names for themselves. I try to like collect and read books by authors like Dion Brand and other people who have sort of lived here for a very long time, and I want to infuse that dynamism and that history and that culture into my poetry. On the occasion that I do write about like the Caribbean, I find that I'm always like drawing on like my own memories of when I lived there when I was like, between 8 to 10. So I wrote a poem about like the Caroni swamp in Trinidad, like just going through the swamp. I've been there twice, and you know, seeing the scarlet ibises and sharks and how people eat sharks in Trinidad and like stuff like that. And I'm wondering how genuine that really is.
Yeah.
And because I worry about stuff like that, right? I worry about like getting it right. I don't know what that means to get it right, because like I said, there's so many ways to be Black. But I find that if I focus on Toronto and if I focus on sort of speculating this space, that I can sort of I feel freer and more flexible to sort of invent and sort of explore those paths, because no one's going to tell me that I'm not a Toronto Black person. Like I am. I live in Toronto and I'm Black. Like that's it, right?
Yeah, I have so much to say about that. Have you heard of the collection? I think it's called Toronto 2033. Have you?
Okay, I have heard of it. I have not read it, but I do know of it, and I know some people who were who wrote for it, who were in it. Yeah.
I haven't. It's actually like literally right here behind me, right beside Dion Brandt. But so
yes.
I have not yet read it, but I want to, and I understand that there's a diverse group of writers in here, and so I hope to get to that so that I can see how people are imagining our city in the future. A lot of the writing that I read is American, and so reading Canadian Afrofuturist writing or Canadian futurist or speculative writing is really inspiring and interesting to me. So my last question for you, although I feel like I want to talk to you a lot longer, and maybe we will do this again, is about it's about the Booktube community. Now, I'm not sure how familiar are you with Booktube?
I know that it exists.
That's
I sort of see it. Okay, no, I sort of see it as like people will go and they'll sort of review books.
Yeah.
On YouTube. Yeah.
And so I think so. It's an interesting place. We're a bunch of reviewers, right? We're book lovers, we're booky people. We read books. We talk about the fact that books exist. We get excited about books that will be coming out. We review them, we talk about them, we recommend them, we interview writers and authors and so on. So it's a pretty vibrant community. And whenever I talk to writers, I like to tell them about Booktube and to remind them, for some, or tell them that there's a bunch of readers out there who are thirsty for their work. So I'm wondering, not specifically around Booktube, but how at this stage of your writing career, how can the bookish community support your writing? Is there like a website where we could subscribe and, you know, keep up to date with your writing? Is there a magazine that you publish in a lot, or is there anything that you'd like to shout out, projects that you'd like us to take a look at? How can we support you so that you can continue to do your heart's work?
I have a website. Just my name, TereseMasonPierre.com, and because a lot of the work I post is online, I can provide links there. I also do review books. I haven't been doing it for very long, and I'm not really sure like if I'm really good at it, but people keep giving me books to review, so I think that means I'm good at it. Yeah. I review for this magazine called Quill and Quire, which is like a Canadian like sort of literature magazine, and so far I've been reviewing books by Black writers. So Desmond Cole recently published his book. I reviewed his book. Eternity Martis came out with her book about like sort of race on campus. I reviewed her book. I review books for them, and there's reviews are also online. But I think that sort of I can be best supported by just general encouragement. Like I'm very shy, and I'm like I find it very difficult sometimes to sort of advocate for myself in my work. But I do. It's mostly through like my website, and I put things there when I feel when I'm proud of them, and I feel like they should be shared. And then I sort of like go back in my writing hole, and then I write, and I don't want anyone to look at me. But yeah, I never really thought about that before. But yeah, I don't have like a trade book or anything. I do have a chapbook, of just poetry, and I'm coming out with another one in July. It's speculative poetry, this one.
Nice.
And I feel a lot more vulnerable with these poems because it's like speculative poetry, and I don't know how it will be received as opposed to like my other like romance, nature, kind of poetry where I'm like, okay, I know there's like people who will read that.
Like me.
Yeah, so I try to make my poems very, because I'm totally aware of like that lack of accessibility that comes with poetry, and I think because a lot of people they come through poetry through like an academic setting, and I think that there's a certain way to write, but I try to not do that with my poetry. I don't have an MFA or a PhD in creative writing, so I don't have that background. Yeah, but those are that's what I sort of write, and those are the projects that I have upcoming.
Cool.
Yes.
Well, let us know when you come out with your book so we can, lift it up and get people to find out about it and purchase it and talk about it, right? Because there is a community of people who want to see more from authors like you and writers like you and poets like you. So we're not patiently waiting for that, because we're thirsty for it. So I just want to thank you. Thank you for everything. This has been wonderful. Thank you for helping me see my city differently. And I wish you all the best. But we're going to talk in the future. This is not like goodbye. This is just, you're great. And thank you for this interview.
Oh, thanks. I feel very honored that I was asked. Like, I don't know how present I am usually. Like, I'm online a bunch, but I'm like, do people see me? Do people know that I'm here? I don't know. So then when you reached out to me, it was like, oh, someone saw me. So
yes, I sure did. That, you know what? Keep on writing articles about Afrofuturism and Canada and being Black, and you will see that people want to have these conversations.